Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso and this is the weekly monk chat opportunity to ask questions about Buddhism. So feel free to type questions into the comments window. I see there's already several questions. Great. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha and then I'll read through the questions and give some replies. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Okay, well, hello to all the people checking in online and all the people who have already put in questions. Gives us a jump start. So hello to Joseph, Richard, Gita, Sood, Lily, Q-Vibe, Kaiser Friend, Lydia, Mike, Sean, Norma, Bhumika, Kim, Louisa, and everyone else who's joining in. So we have a question here from Joseph. So it says, in Anguttara Nikaya 4.268, the Buddha describes 4 qualities related to abstaining from divisive speech, not engaging in it, encouraging others to refrain, approving of refraining, and praising non-divisiveness. And in the sutta, the same structure is applied to divisive speech as in the case of abstaining from killing. And Joseph says, I would like to understand the precise meaning and nuances of the Pali terms used in this context, particularly pativirto, refraining personally from divisive speech. Yeah, pativirto, it literally just means refraining or completely abstaining from. Samadipati, encouraging others to refrain from it. Yeah, causing others to do so or inciting other people to do so. Yeah, samanyano, approving of refraining from it. Yeah, samanyano, approving of not engaging in divisive speech. Yep. And vandang basati, praising, refraining from it. Yeah, vandang basati means to speak in praise of. So Joseph says, could you explain how these terms function in the context of right speech and how they relate to both personal virtue and the encouragement of virtue in others? Well, again, I think the Buddha actually gives a really nice summary of 4 aspects of moral principles, which is first off to follow the moral principle yourself. So this is the most fundamental aspect of it. First thing first is follow the precepts, follow the Eightfold Path, do your best to uphold the principles of moral conduct. So that's the first one. Second one is encouraging other people to do so. So look to see what you can do to help to support the morality practice of the people around you. So if you see somebody about to kill some insects, you can suggest maybe there's a way to remove them without killing them or without harming them. Or if you know somebody who's thinking about lying about something, you can praise the value of honesty and truthfulness and so on. Or if you know somebody who's prone to harsh speech, you can encourage gentle speech. So of course one needs to be careful and sensitive to when it's the right time to offer that kind of advice. But it is actually often quite useful to give that sort of encouragement to other people. And approving of it. So if you know somebody else who also has good moral principles, then praise it. Express your approval of the good moral behaviors of other people. And speaking in praise of it, the fourth one. So openly praising morality, practices of morality and kindness and self-restraint. Yeah, I think the Buddha actually gives a really good summary with these 4 aspects of morality. And you can see how they're a progression. So it starts with doing it yourself. Next is in encouraging other people to do it, approving of it, and praising it. Okay. Richard says, how would one go a conversation about aloofness and arousing energy? Oh, aloofness. I'm trying to remember what the Pali word is. But briefly, it's about not constantly seeking involvement with other people. So a lot of people have this sense of loneliness whenever they're not interacting with other people. They have this urge to interact with other people, or they do it as a form of entertainment or a form of distraction, or they do it as a way of projecting their ego, projecting their self-identity. So when the Buddha is talking about aloofness, it's talking about the contentment with solitude, contentment with being by yourself, not needing to have other people around you in order to be happy. So I know one person in particular comes to mind that I know who just really, really suffers being alone for any amount of time. So even just a couple hours without talking to somebody, that is an utter nightmare for them. And my observation of this person is that they are creating an enormous amount of suffering for themselves. That they've built up this incredible addiction to social interaction to the point where they basically can't live a normal life. Or rather, what they think of as a normal life is not what I would consider to be a normal life. Like for them, a normal life means constantly talking and interacting with people. But then that means that when that's not accessible, then they're miserable. So that's an example which, again, this addiction to social interaction, this addiction to being involved with other people. And so training the mind to be totally content without other people involved, to be totally content just by yourself without needing to interact with other people. And also not getting involved in other people's business. In the sense of when other people are happy, then you're happy. When other people are sad, then you're sad. When other people are angry, then you're angry. So that tendency that one might have to take on the emotions and attitudes of other people and then start copying that within yourself. So that's another danger of getting mixed up with other people, is that you might start taking on their negative emotional patterns and thought patterns. So aloofness doesn't mean that you should avoid other people all the time, but rather it means that one needs to keep some sense of a barrier between yourself and others, in the sense that we don't want to start inheriting the harmful patterns and behaviors of the people around us. We don't want to start taking on the harmful emotional patterns of the people around us. And also we don't want to form attachments and addictions to social interactions of any sort, whether it's with a particular person or just interaction in general. So cultivating a mind which can be perfectly happy just to be alone for hours or days or weeks or months at a time. Personally, I love it. I love being alone. I would spend all my time alone if I could. As for the topic of arousing energy, so there's a few ways the Buddha talks about arousing energy, but one of the most common and relevant ones is the description of samavayama, of right effort, as we find it in the Eightfold Path, which is the effort to prevent unwholesome mind states from arising and to remove any that have arisen, and the effort to produce wholesome mind states and to maintain and perfect those that are already present. So that's actually Buddhism in a nutshell. Buddhism is the fourfold practice of right effort. And Sud says, what are your thoughts on incorporating a practice where we say, how would a noble disciple of the Buddha act in this situation, and acting accordingly? Kind of imitating a stream enterer or once returner, etc. Would this make one progress, or is it just pushing one more into delusion? That actually is a way of practicing which is recommended in a few places in the suttas. Actually, in the Uposatha Sutta, the Buddha is saying that we should practice the Uposatha, follow the 8 precepts, because this is imitating the behavior of arhants. It's for one day one is acting like an arhat. So actually, imitating the behavior of awakened beings is one of the ways of training yourself to progress towards awakening. So absolutely, yes, that is a way of practicing. Just don't start convincing yourselves that you're something you're not. But if you're like, oh, I'm copying the behavior of awakened beings in order to progress towards awakening, then that's definitely correct. But this does take some wisdom in that it's understanding the distinction between the distinctive behaviors and characteristics of awakened beings versus the behaviors and characteristics of a specific person that you think is awakened. An example of this is there's a former monk I know who he was staying with a very senior monk in Thailand, and this ex-monk was very convinced that the senior monk was fully awakened. And this particular senior monk had a habit of bad posture. So he was always kind of sitting hunched over with his chin kind of jutted out. And he was also very old, so possibly he just had some physical posture issues. But then this young monk who was staying with this senior monk, he then started imitating all of the physical mannerisms of this senior monk who he thought was enlightened, even to the point of imitating a kind of like hunchbacked, crooked neck posture of the senior monk. And it's like, well, that's really missing the point. Awakened beings don't necessarily have bad posture and crooked necks. Like that was just the case of this one particular monk. There's also, I'm not convinced that monk is even enlightened, but definitely trying to imitate those behavior patterns is completely missing the point. It's imitating the behavior patterns of perfect morality, of renunciation, of compassion, of contentment, and so on. So Lily asks, are the 7 factors of awakening qualities that only an awakened person fully possesses? Or is it that only they can fully cultivate and master these 7 factors? I would say that these 7 factors are accessible to everyone, but that they are only at 100% development in a fully awakened person. But that Buddhist practice, one of the ways of relating to Buddhist practice, and actually one of the ways that I use most often, is that Buddhist practice is about incrementing the 7 factors of awakening, bit by bit. So maybe today you're at 1% sati and 2% dhammavicaya and 1% euphoria and so on. It's like, well, okay, then just work on gradually increasing that number. Maybe next year you'll be up to 1.1% mindfulness. That's great. That's progress. So only an arhat is going to have 100% in all 7 categories, but you can work on gradually increasing however much you have in each of these 7 categories. Q-Vibe says, how can I tell whether my current human life is one of the last 7 human rebirths of a stream enterer, or just a random human one between the ones in various realms? So, if you are a stream enterer, then you know with absolute, complete, unshakable certainty. This is one of the defining characteristics of a stream enterer, is they are 100% absolutely certain that they are a stream enterer, and nothing can shake their faith in that. So if you have to ask, if you're like, oh, I'm not sure whether or not this is one of my last 7 rebirths, then that means it isn't. That means you're not a stream enterer, and therefore this is not one of your last 7 births. Okay, and Lily asks, what is the boundary between contentment and learned helplessness? I don't know what learned helplessness means. So if you define learned helplessness, I might be able to answer your question. Okay, and Lily has another question. Is there a way to live a life free from worldly disturbances, quiet and peaceful, where one can focus on Dhamma study for 8 hours a day without doing monastery chores and still keeping one's hair? Well, I would ask 2 things. 1, why are you attached to your hair? And 2, why are you resistant to doing chores? Because that right there sounds to me like desire and aversion. And in fact, that means you should probably go somewhere where you have to do some chores and cut your hair. Because it sounds to me like you've got some defilements in those 2 areas. That said, yes, there absolutely are monasteries, mostly in Asia. Not so many outside of Asia, but there are definitely a lot of monasteries in Asia where lay people can go and stay for as long as they want and be given many, many hours a day just to do meditation and Dhamma study. There's lots and lots of such places. In the Western world, they're much more rare. In the Western world, most monasteries have a schedule which involves chores and a certain amount of activities. But often there is a fair amount of time to do study and practice of your own. Usually, it depends on the monastery, but it's pretty normal to have a few hours of personal practice time every day. And if one is just staying as a lay resident, then one does not normally need to shave one's head. Yeah, I would ask you, you should ask yourself why you're so attached to your hair. And it's literally just dead flesh hanging from your scalp. It's like saying like, oh, I'm attached to the dead skin on the bottom of my foot. It's like, well, why? Like, oh, I'm really attached to my saliva. It's like, why? I really want to keep my urine. It's like, why? Like, what is this obsession with hair? Like, again, it's literally just little dead bits of your body hanging off of your head. Okay. And as for your resistance to doing chores, this means that you're actually missing a very important principle of Dhamma practice, which is about practicing Dhamma at all times in all activities. So monastery work is a way of helping us to bring our Dhamma practice into everything that we do. So if you're assigned to sweep the floor, then you sweep the floor with a heart of mindfulness and compassion, with kindness and equanimity. And you can recollect the Buddha and the Dhamma while doing so. So learning how to keep practicing during activity is very important. Okay, next question. Q-Vibe says, in the 12 links of Paticca how exactly does ignorance condition formations? What is the precise process by which this occurs? Could you please elaborate on the details? Oh boy, so whenever we start talking about Paticca, usually we're in for about a 3-hour Dhamma talk. Like, this is not a topic which can be explained quickly and easily. There's also a wide variety of different ways of interpreting and explaining and applying these principles. So I'll say a little bit. Ignorance is defined usually as either ignorance of the Four Noble Truths or ignorance of the three characteristics. In either case, based upon that fundamental ignorance, then one engages in the construction of viewpoints and opinions and ways of relating to the world and ways of seeing physical and mental reality, which is based upon delusion, and particularly based upon the delusion of self-existence, the delusion of persistence, persistent existence, the delusion of conditional happiness. So then based upon that, then we engage in behaviors and actions, which then leads to the unfolding of the whole 12 links, culminating in the whole mass of suffering. So I won't elaborate on the details, because if I did, we would have no time for the rest of the questions. Again, it's a 3-hour Dhamma talk in itself. And Mike says, how does one properly cultivate appamada? So appamada is the opposite of the word pamada, and pamada itself comes from the root mud, which means intoxicate. So pamada literally means intoxication. It's commonly translated as negligence, which is okay, but it's good to understand what it's talking about. It's talking about this blurry, unrestrained state of mind. And I think about when you're drunk. Well, hopefully you don't get drunk. Think about in the past when you used to make the bad choice of getting drunk. What was your mind like when it was drunk? It was blurry, and it lacked restraint. Blurry and unrestrained. So what is the opposite of blurry and unrestrained? It's when the mind is sharp, clear, paying full attention, and is in full self-control, full self-restraint. So that's appamada. So to practice appamada, you need to cultivate mindfulness and self-restraint. Constantly paying full, clear, sharp attention to your experience, full spectrum. So all your senses, full, constant, sharp, clear attention to your full sensory domain, including your mind. And restrain yourself. Watch the arising of impulses and urges and don't give in to them. Actively try to cultivate wholesome actions. Actively try to stop unwholesome actions. This is appamada. So appamada has a distinct moral connotation as well, on top of what I've said. Appamada is also the heedful, mindful, vigilant effort to not do evil things and to instead do good things. Lily says, if one has developed an undeniable interest in spiritual practice, including meditation, do you think it would be worthwhile to try full-time, long-term retreats at one or multiple places? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, even if you're not planning to be a monk, doing long-term stays at monasteries is great. Really good for your practice. I know a lot of lay people who they have no interest in becoming monks, but they spend several weeks or even several months at monasteries every year. And they've just integrated that into their life. And it brings really good results. It's really beneficial. A couple examples which I actually really enjoy is there's a few married couples that I know who go to monasteries together. So of course they're usually staying in separate quarters and they're following celibacy while they're at the monastery. But it's a really beautiful thing to do. It's like, oh, this married couple goes and stays at the monastery for a few weeks and practices there together for a few weeks. And then they leave and carry on with their ordinary lay married life, doing whatever it is married lay people do. But they find it incredibly nourishing and beneficial to periodically do long stays at a monastery. So Lily says, regarding who is being reborn, I came across a saying that, is the flame in the middle of the night the same as the flame later in the night? The answer given was, it cannot be said to be the same, nor can it said to be different. This makes sense to me, but causing more curiosity. Does similar topics, such as the 14 unanswerable questions, hold no meaning completely, or still worth some exploration into it? I find them really intriguing, though. So I'm familiar with a list of 10 unanswerable questions. I'm not familiar with 14. So maybe if you could say what the 14 are. I'm used to a list of 10. But yeah, I mean, if the Buddha said something's not worth exploring, then that means it's not worth exploring. And the Buddha did say that the 10 unanswerable questions are just a complete waste of time, that it's impossible to reach an answer to them. And in doing so, you will just waste time. So it's not worth wasting your time. Okay, Kauser friend says, in first jhana there is vitakka and vichara. In second jhana there is not. I've seen different translations for this. How should these terms be understood? Well, there's a lot of different opinions about what these terms mean. And a lot of it actually comes down to, well, I mean, the big thing is whether somebody follows the suttas or follows the commentaries. That's the big difference. So the commentaries completely rewrote the definition of these words. But if you look how it's used in the suttas, the word vitakka is a perfectly ordinary word that appears all throughout the suttas, and it just means thought. Vichara is also a perfectly ordinary word that appears throughout the suttas, and it means exploration or movement. Actually, movement is even more literal. Literally, it means moving around. So vitakka means thinking, and vichara means movement, mental movement in this case. So in first jhana, my understanding of this is that in first jhana, although the mind is not moving from its meditation object, although the mind is very peaceful, very still, there's still a little bit of background noise in the mind. Kind of like if you're overhearing somebody else's conversation in the distance. So you can just barely make out the words, but you're not interested. Like the conversation is not about a topic that you're interested in. It doesn't involve you. It's not related to you. You don't know the people who are talking. It's just totally irrelevant. So you're aware of the background noise, but you're not affected by it at all. So that's my understanding of vitakka and vichara in the first jhana. It's that kind of distant background noise that can still persist in the mind, even when the mind is deeply immersed in meditation. And then with second jhana, even that background noise fades away entirely and the mind becomes completely silent. Lily says, how can one maintain inner peace like still water when encountering someone who is extremely rude? Well, one thing that's useful is to remember that they're not insulting you. They're insulting their mental image of you. That can help. And also when the person is being rude, all they're actually doing is they're just broadcasting how unenlightened they are to everybody else. So it's actually just them showing off their own flaws. So you can have compassion for that person, compassion for how deeply flawed their mind is, to the point where they actually are showing off their flaws to the world without realizing what they're doing. So again, it's like a crazy person running naked in the streets. You just have compassion for that person. Well, in the same case, here is somebody who's being extremely rude. We'll have compassion for them. They're just showing off how messed up they are. So that's very sad, and wish for them to get better. Wish for them to develop wisdom and kindness and self-restraint in the future for their own sake, as well as for the sake of the people around them. Q-Vibe says, how would monastics face the death of a close friend? Well, monastics are people, and there's a lot of variety among monastics, just as there's a lot of variety among all other kinds of people. So it depends. If a monastic is not fully enlightened, then they might be very upset about the death of a close friend. And most monastics are not fully enlightened. If one is a very well-developed practitioner, then such things will not bother you. But that's talking about someone whose practice is extremely advanced. Most people are nowhere close to that point, whether they're monastics or not. Okay, Mo says, while meditating, I was noticing a stress feeling that arose because I am aware of the actions of a colleague and how resources and spaces are being used and the impact in our community. Okay. Oh, that's not actually a question. That's just a statement. So, Mo, I don't know if you had an actual question involved. Okay, next question. Venerable says, you previously used, Lily says, Venerable, you previously used the analogy of different spiritual goals or religions being like different mountain peaks. By the height of the mountains, I mean, is one objectively better or higher than another? In the eyes of Buddhists, is Buddhism considered the highest peak amongst all? For example, seeing the Buddha as the greatest being in the world? I mean, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Buddha was very clear about this. He was very clear that Buddhist awakening is the highest spiritual attainment that's possible. And he was very clear that a Buddha or an Arahant is in fact the most spiritually advanced being possible. So yes, it's true. Yeah. So of course there's lots of great things in other religions and other spiritual systems. So we appreciate those good things. But yeah, this is actually the standard Buddhist view. Of course, that's not surprising. Pretty much every religion thinks they're the best. It's kind of usually what defines religions. Jojo says, is it a regular occurrence to be guilty, to feel bad about moral conduct, even when that same person hasn't done anything bad like breaking the precepts? If you haven't done anything bad, then what do you have to feel guilty about? I don't understand. Okay, and Mo says, is moral shame aversion or simply the recognition that things can go better? So it depends what you mean by moral shame. If you're referring to a translation of the Pali word hiri, I would argue, as I've been arguing for many, many, many years now, that shame is just a really bad mistranslation of that word. So hiri means conscience, the awareness of good and bad, so a moral compass. And here he has the sense of compunction to follow your moral compass. So it's both having a strong moral compass, and also the sense of the importance of following your moral compass. So hiri, translating hiri and its companion word ottappa, some of the older translations had that translated as moral shame and moral dread, which I find shameful and dreadful. Conscience and consideration was an alternative translation that was posed several years ago. I don't remember by who, but I think that's much closer to the actual meaning of these words. So Lily says, if everything happening now is determined by past karma, does that mean up until this very moment, everything that has ever happened in the past was predestined to happen? In other words, was there never anything that should not have happened? Well, first off, I would not use the word predestined, and that's quite awkward. Rather, I would say that, for example, if you throw something up in the air, it's pretty reasonable to expect it to fall back down. Does that mean it was predestined to fall back down? It's a bit of an awkward word to use. If instead we say, did you put into place the causes and conditions that would lead to the ball falling back down? Then the answer is yes. So I wouldn't use the word predestined, but I would say that, again, the law of karma is explaining one-to-one cause and effect relationships and saying that literally all of reality is woven of these direct cause-effect relationships. And yes, that does mean that nothing that has ever happened is something that shouldn't have happened. Literally everything that ever has happened and ever will happen should in fact happen, in the sense that it is simply expressing the natural law of cause and effect. That doesn't mean it's good necessarily, nor does it necessarily mean it's bad, but it does mean that every single thing that happens is a necessary component of reality. So reality contains within it every imaginable possible thing. None of it can be removed. All of it is a necessary component. So in that sense, yes, everything that happens had to happen. But that doesn't mean we can't do things differently, because we can. And we can steer where we go in samsara. And we can also steer ourselves right to awakening, if we're careful. Okay. And Zero Agenda says, hello, I'm John. Hello, John/Zero Agenda. So John says, I've recently finished reading In the Buddha's Words, translated by Eknath Easwaran. Unless there's another book of that name. The one that I'm aware of is by Bhante Bodhi, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. But maybe there's another word by Eknath Easwaran. I don't know. So John says, I'm currently immersed in the Dhammapada. As someone new to this journey, what would you recommend I read next? I would recommend you read In the Buddha's Words by Bhikkhu Bodhi, which is a collection of early Buddhist scriptures compiled in a logical way in order to give one an overview of Buddhist doctrine. Mo says, could things like shame be understood in terms of hindrances? I'm meditating and consciousness calls me to correct something, and at the same time I have an opinion of judgment to what is happening. I do not understand. Let me see. Could shame be understood in terms of hindrances? I'm meditating and consciousness calls me to correct something, at the same time an opinion of judgment to what is happening. I'm sorry, Mo, I really don't understand what you're asking. Please try to rephrase your question. Lily says, if we were born during the time when Shakyamuni Buddha was still alive, would attaining awakening be much easier? Could simply speaking with him potentially lead to full awakening? It seems that many such cases are recorded. Well, first off, I would just say that you aren't. You aren't currently living in the time of Shakyamuni Buddha. So instead of speculating, oh, would it have been easier 2,500 years ago? Instead, just ask yourself, how can I practice well right now? Because of course, we can fill our mind with all kinds of thoughts about what if the past was different, what if I lived here or there or in that time or with that person. But that's all just useless speculation. All it does is just make the mind noisy. So instead of asking, would it be easier if I'd been alive during the time of the Buddha, instead ask yourself, what can I do to practice well right now? That said, the Buddha was in fact the supreme teacher. That's one of the characteristics of a Buddha. So the Buddha knew how to teach people in the way that was most likely to be helpful for them. But he wasn't always successful because it still depended upon the other person wanting to learn and wanting to practice the Dhamma. There are some suttas where people seem to attain awakening very quickly from the Buddha's instructions. There's also some suttas where people receive instructions from the Buddha and do not understand, or where they even reject the Buddha's words, or where they contradict the Buddha and say the opposite. So there's many cases where somebody was right in the presence of the Buddha, being taught the Dhamma by the Buddha, and did not make one step towards awakening. So clearly that's not sufficient just to be in the presence of a Buddha. Julie says, my friend was sick and received medical assistance. What did the Buddha say about taking one's life in this way? By medical assistance, do you mean medically assisted suicide? Is that what you're talking about, Julie? Anyway, this is to some degree a debatable point, but I'm pretty firmly of the opinion that the suttas are quite clear that killing a sentient being is unwholesome. And I don't know of any places in the suttas where an exception is made if that sentient being is yourself. So as far as I can tell from the suttas, suicide is killing a sentient being and therefore is an unwholesome action. There are some people who argue otherwise based upon a couple obscure and hotly debated lines in the suttas. But I would say that since 99% of the message in the suttas is very clear on this, that taking a stance based upon this couple of obscure points is really not a valid standpoint. So I am pretty strongly of the opinion that yes, suicide still counts as killing and therefore counts as an unwholesome action. Yes, I'm not a fan of euthanasia. Also for animals, I don't approve of euthanasia. I think it's barbaric. And definitely not for humans. So even if the person is requesting it, well, if somebody's ready to die, then just let them die naturally. Like, you don't need to accelerate the process. If somebody is dying, then they'll die when their body's ready to die. But there's no need to accelerate the process. That's just generating bad karma by killing. Q-Vibe says, if compassion is unconditional, how should one reconcile it when it comes into conflict with justice? Well, what do you mean by justice? So Buddhism is not concerned with justice. Besides which, you don't need to worry about justice because karma. If somebody did something bad, it will come back to them eventually anyway. So you don't need to worry about carrying out justice. It carries itself out. What you do need to worry about is cultivating a Buddha-like mind, which means cultivating compassion. Lily says, if I suddenly feel hungry outside of regular mealtime and want to eat a specific food, then immediately go out to buy and eat it, would this be considered self-indulgence? Yes, absolutely. Gosh, I mean, wow. Restrain yourself, Lily. And Lily says, how does one distinguish between fulfilling a need and indulging in cravings? I recommend taking on clear restrictions on when you eat, and then you will learn the distinction. So in monasteries, it's quite common to eat only once or twice a day at specific times. So here at this monastery, we normally eat only once a day at 9 a.m. and the rest of the day we don't eat. And this means that anytime cravings arise throughout the day, you know that it's just your mind playing tricks on you. So I recommend setting clear meal times and don't break them, and see how that affects your relationship with food. And yeah, you will start to realize that a lot of the cravings which arise actually don't have anything to do with bodily needs. Okay. M.O. said, I heard a couple who were giving a Dhamma talk and talked about the erotic as Dhamma. That's interesting. Then they said that they invite desire to have mindfulness of it to learn about themselves. That is not Buddhism. I mean, it's interesting. It just doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism. It blows my mind what people call Dhamma these days. It wouldn't surprise me if you found a Dhamma talk about mindfully deer hunting, mindfully torturing small children or something. I mean, people are mindfully doing all kinds of things these days. That doesn't make it Buddhist. So M.O. continues. This talk triggered me. Good. I'm triggered just by what you said about it. M.O. says, this talk triggered me. I am a layperson. I'm trying not to encourage desire in any way. In fact, I stopped dating. What do you advise? I think you're doing great, M.O. M.O. says, I have not chosen to be celibate, but I have a feeling that encouraging desire is dangerous. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. This is the arising of wisdom. Yes, this is wisdom. Okay. M.O. continues. Then this couple said in the non-Dhamma talk, let the body be your guide. Have fun. Play. Holy heck, these people are making a huge amount of bad karma and they're probably going to be reborn in hell. I mean, of course it's fine. Like if non-celibate lay people want to do non-celibate things, of course that's okay. And it's just bringing you to animal rebirth, but it's okay. But if somebody is claiming that Buddha Dhamma means wildly indulging your sexual desires, then they're going to hell because they're teaching wrong Dhamma. They're teaching anti-Dhamma. They're deliberately spreading misinformation about Buddha Dhamma. So that's really, really bad karma. So I have compassion for these poor people who are making such awful karma by spreading such misinformation about Buddhism. Okay, so M.O. says, I also feel that this is dangerous, but I am a layperson and I still care to have a sexual life and a partner. Advice, the exploration of sensuality and sexuality, how the Dhamma changes it. Well, I mean, I liked your previous thing about not dating because you don't want to encourage desire. That was very much in accordance with Dhamma. But for somebody who doesn't want to be celibate, the advice in the suttas is to maintain boundaries of trust, mutual respect within one's relationships. So if you do get into a committed relationship, then respect the boundaries of that relationship. Be faithful to your partner. Don't cheat on them. And within that relationship, practice kindness and compassion and respect for your partner. So rather than using the relationship just as a way of indulging your desires, use it as a way of building up these wholesome virtues of kindness and compassion. And constantly check to see, is it actually having that effect? Is the relationship actually making you a better person, or is it just fueling your animalistic impulses? So always evaluating, is this having a wholesome effect or an unwholesome effect? Okay, wow, still lots of questions. See the next one. Kim Jordan says, can you talk about the nada sound, also called the sound of silence by Ajahn Sumedho? Not really, because I don't do that practice. I experimented with it a bit many years ago, but I don't normally do it. I mean, the sound is immediately accessible. Like just from your mentioning it, I'm like, oh yeah, there it is. It's still there. But I don't personally use it as a meditation object. So I don't normally talk about it. But it's a bit like buzzing or humming noise in the mind. It's always there. And so some people use that as a meditation object. I never found it that useful, so I didn't do it very much. And M.O. says, have you ever thought or felt trapped in the life of seclusion? No, never. Wow, no, not once. Well, first of all, I love it. And two, we can leave whenever we want. it's really easy to disrobe. In fact, it's very common as well. Someone's a monk for a few years and then they disrobe, and it's like, oh, okay, good luck. So I've never felt trapped. Well, one, I love this life, and two, I know I can always leave if I want to, and I just don't want to because I love it. Nemo says, how to find courage to want a life of complete renunciation and seclusion. If you don't want it, then you don't want it. It's kind of as simple as that. Trying to make yourself want it is a little bit futile. But where it comes from is from recognizing the peacefulness and serenity and ease of not relying upon anybody or anything else. That might help to cultivate your enthusiasm for it. Okay, Zero Agenda says, as I'm learning to be honest with myself, I find myself frequently revisiting painful past memories. Yeah, stop doing that. Zero Agenda says, how can I turn this process into constructive meditation? You can't. It's useless. Stop doing it. So memories are just meaningless stories in the mind. Don't waste your time. They're useless. Just drop them. When they appear, just see them as meaningless stories about somebody else. And drop it. Get on with your life. Kauser friend says, thank you for your explanation of Vitakam. So should thought be understood as just verbal thought, or also any sort of images, memories, etc. that arises? I take it as any mental object that arises. So again, it's just that there can still be the arising of some amount of mental phenomena in the background. But the important point with first jhana is that it does not distract you at all. So the mind does not move towards it. One's attention does not move towards those mental objects. They just kind of drift through the background of the mind, but without pulling your attention. Okay, Lily says, if our future is entirely shaped by present and past karma, yet we have no way of knowing how much or what kind of karma we have accumulated in the past, nor to what extent our efforts from now on can actually alter the course of the future, does this imply that fate still carries an inherent uncertainty and a sense of helplessness despite one realizing causality? Yeah, I mean, to some degree. Yeah, because, I mean, who knows what we did in the past? We might have done all kinds of awful or weird things in the past. And who knows when or how that's going to express its results. So yeah, there's a certain amount of uncertainty and helplessness there. And okay, resign yourself to that. If you fight it, you suffer. If you resign yourself to it, then you don't suffer. And that's Buddhism. Buddhism is choosing to not suffer. In every moment, choose to not suffer. That's Buddhism. That's it. That's really it. Everything else is just a detailed explanation of that basic principle. In every moment, choose to not suffer. So yeah, is there a sense of inherent uncertainty and helplessness from the past? Yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay. Big deal. And you can also focus on the fact that in a present moment, you can still make good choices. You can still make choices that create the conditions for the future arising of wisdom and happiness and serenity. Lily says, is causality still worth studying? To the extent that it helps you understand how to practice the Dhamma, yes. Kauser friend says, what is the proper way to discuss parts of Dhamma we don't know for ourselves to be true, but only take on faith? Things like rebirth in gods. It feels wrong to present this as truth without knowing. Well, actually, the Chunky Sutta gives a good set of principles on this, where the Buddha talks about how to preserve truth. So there the Buddha says, if it is your belief that something is true, then do not say, this is true. Instead say, it is my belief that this is true. Or if you heard something is true, then don't say, this is true. Instead say, I heard this is true. Or if it's a tradition that something is true, then don't say this is true, but rather say it is traditional that this is true. So just being really clear. So you can actually say like, well, according to traditional Buddhist teachings, there is rebirth, there are gods, it works like this, it works like that. That's already sufficient. If you need to say something more, you can say things like, I don't yet myself have direct experiential proof of this, but it's something that I take on faith for the time being. Or you can say it's something which helps me understand Buddhism. So it's useful as a framework of understanding. So just being really clear. So rather than saying, this is true, instead you can say something like, this is the standard Buddhist teaching about what is true. That said, rebirth is true, and there are devas. Cricket says, what about pain? What about it? It's part of reality, like everything else. Can't escape it. Now, what you can do is choose to not be bothered by it. Okay. Mo says, is the stress of not having good moral conscience aversion? If I am meditating and feel remorse, is that a hindrance? How to deal with remorse? Is the stress of not having good moral conscience aversion? I don't understand what you mean by that. So the problem with somebody not having a sense of morality, not having a conscience, a sense of right and wrong, is that then they will tend to make a lot of bad choices, a lot of evil karma, which then will make them even more enmeshed in the painful and confusing side of samsara. So that's the real danger there. And yeah, it does cause a certain amount of suffering, even in the present life. And if you feel remorse, is that a hindrance? It depends on the remorse, but generally speaking, if remorse just arises of its own accord in the mind, then you just watch it come and go like everything else. But if you find yourself actively engaging in remorse, then one thing that's really helpful is to remind yourself the past is over. I cannot change the past. However, I have resolved to be a good person from this day forth. So starting right now, I am a good person. No matter what happened in the past, I am currently a good person because I am currently committed to morality. So then remorse becomes irrelevant because it's not talking about you. So Mo continues, I had an abortion. After the abortion, I began to practice more deeply in the Dhamma, but an abortion is breaking a precept. Also, the father did not want to take responsibility, and I thought it is very difficult to have a child alone. How can I relieve my bad moral conduct, but also reconcile myself with the fact that I had no support, and that, in fact, it has been good not to have had a child because I can focus more on my practice and its father also. What is your view about this issue? So it's quite a complex issue, and there's different opinions about it. One thing I will say is that there is nowhere in the suttas where this is spoken about in a clear and undeniable way. So there's nowhere in the suttas where it clearly, undeniably states that abortions qualify as killing a sentient being. So there is speculation, and different Buddhist teachers have come to different conclusions precisely because there is no clear statement to be found anywhere in the suttas. And this is interesting because if it was a big deal, then you would think the Buddha would have said something clearly stating that it's a big deal. If there's absolutely nothing to be found in the suttas about it, well, that's interesting purely because it's not found anywhere, which implies that the Buddha didn't have much to say, if anything at all, on the topic. It's clear that abortion was known about and practiced in the time of the Buddha because it's mentioned in the Vinaya. But it doesn't specifically say anywhere that it qualifies as breaking the precept. So I would not necessarily come to the conclusion that you broke the first precept. I mean, some people would say you did, and others would say you didn't. Yeah, and again, what's done is done. So rather than roll around and like, oh, did I do the right thing or the wrong thing? Instead, just like, well, it's over. And you're here now, and you're practicing as best You're practicing as best you can now, and that's what's most important. And Scott says, engagement ring, wedding ring, suffer ring. Yep. Okay, Zero Agenda says, I live near Empty Cloud Monastery and I'm working up the courage to visit. Come, come, we're not as scary as we look. Do I look scary? No? Okay. Maybe a little bit, slightly scary. Okay, it's true, I'm scary. Okay, come visit. We have, so they say, do you offer introductory sessions for newcomers? Yes, Saturdays. Come Saturday at 6 p.m. Or even as early as 5 p.m. There's a Q&A session. You can come ask some questions and then join the meditation at 6 o'clock. Gregory says, as I understand it, monastics who break precepts confess to another monastic. How should lay people best correct themselves after breaking precepts? Actually, in the suttas, it says that you should go to your spiritual teacher or to another spiritual practitioner who you trust and respect and confess. Confess whatever you did and vow to do better in the future. So it could be to a monk who you respect, or it could be to another lay practitioner who you trust. But this is the Buddha's advice. So for monastics, we have a formalized procedure. For lay people, there's not a formal procedure, but you can do something similar. And Lily says, if a job brings continuous suffering, should one change it as soon as possible? How does one discern whether enduring the discomfort is a form of perseverance or simply unnecessary suffering? Well, I mean, it's difficult to give a clear answer to this without knowing the situation. So you should evaluate for yourself why the job is causing you suffering. And if in fact you come to the conclusion that it's just completely unnecessary, then yeah, quit and get a different job. But you might come to the conclusion that there's actually nothing wrong with the job, and if you change your attitude, then the suffering will stop. Again, you can't really give a direct answer of like, you should definitely quit or you should definitely persevere, but rather you need to evaluate for yourself. Is this something which I can use as a supportive condition for cultivating mindfulness, equanimity, perseverance, determination? Or is this just something which is fueling my defilements and making me more miserable without making me a better person? So you need to evaluate those things. So one of the ways you know Buddhist practice is working is if you're getting increasingly happy and peaceful over time. So if you're doing something that's making you less happy and less peaceful, you're probably not practicing the Dhamma correctly. Okay, and 534590820 says, a bit of an awkward name, says, is there value in engaging with difficult relationships or experiences that provoke strong reactions within oneself, especially when coupled with meditation or mindfulness? I mean, there can be. Again, you want to evaluate, is your practice strong enough to use those difficult situations as a way of getting better, is improving your heart? Or is it just something which is going to crush you? It's too much for you. So again, I often use weightlifting as a metaphor for Dhamma practice. So if you are doing weight training and you lift weights that are a little bit above your comfort level, then you'll gradually get stronger. But if you lift weights that are way above your comfort level, you can actually injure your muscles, which will then set you back. So it winds up being not only useless, but actually harmful. So we need to evaluate our life circumstances in the same way. If our circumstances are just crushingly overpowering to the point where we're just generating even more suffering and confusion and building up our defilements even more, well, that's not useful. But on the other hand, if we're really lax and complacent and lazy, that's not useful either. So you want your Dhamma life to be a little bit challenging, but not too challenging, but also not too lax. And you figure that out through experimentation and observation. Lily says, do you think the following comment is reasonable? The best way to express dislike for someone is to not tell them where they are wrong. I usually don't recommend expressing dislike for people. Yeah, I don't get the point of this quote. It doesn't sound very Buddhist to me.
Kind of saying the kind thing to do is to tell someone, like to give them feedback.
Oh, like it's expressed in the reverse. Like you should give the person feedback so they can improve.
I wonder.
Could be. I mean, the Buddha, there's a sutta where the Buddha says that the worst thing that can happen is when your spiritual practitioners stop criticizing you. So yeah, not telling someone where they're wrong is in fact harmful. Helping people improve is a good thing. But the point is you need to be coming from a place of compassion, of really genuinely wanting to help the other person improve, rather than just wanting to criticize and fault find, just out of hostility or aversion. ML says, for example, the nada sound. Buddha did not say anything about it. Why should I try it? You don't have to try it. It's not found in the suttas, and I'm usually not a huge fan of recommending things that aren't found in the suttas. So MO, you don't have to try it. Kauser friend says, I would like to know for sure the devas are real rather than taking it on faith. Is there any practice I could do to make this happen? Yes, follow the Noble Eightfold Path. Just keep practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, and one day you will start to attain stages of awakening, and then you will know for absolute certainty that devas are real. It might happen before then, but it will eventually happen. Okay, Sud says, if one meditates 3 hours a day, wow, that's great. Yeah. One meditates 3 hours a day and takes 5-minute breaks every hour from the day to meditate as well, except for sleeping hours. Do you think it will help? Or is it too much in lay life? I think that's great. If you can actually make that fit into your daily schedule, that's really good. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So HPD says, I have a question about metta. My uncle stole and lied to me. I've been trying to send him metta for his suffering, but realized I'm sending it out of anger and pity. I'm still mocking his suffering out of anger. How can I improve my intentions? I feel guilty. So first off, it's impossible to send metta. So you do metta for your own benefit. Metta is not for the benefit of others. Well, I mean, indirectly it is. But metta is first and foremost for your own benefit. It's for purifying your mind of hostility and aversion. So what I recommend is do metta for other people, not your uncle. Do metta for anybody who you don't have any resentment or hostility towards. Then once your heart is absolutely radiant and overflowing with metta for someone who it's very easy, then you can start to allow it to include your uncle as well. Because like if you have anger and pity and mocking, well, that's not metta. Those are all really dark, horrible, painful emotions, really unwholesome, harmful emotions. So when you're rolling around in those kinds of emotions, you're just torturing yourself. You're tormenting yourself. So that's one way to change that, is recognizing like, oh, like holding on to all this resentment towards my uncle, it's just hurting me for no reason. It's totally pointless to hurt yourself. Whereas when you cultivate metta, again, I recommend for the time being, for anyone other than your uncle, practice metta for anybody else. When you practice metta, then the heart feels light and joyful and spacious and free. So then you start to notice that difference. When the mind is full of anger and hostility and resentment, then it feels very miserable and uncomfortable. When the mind is full of love and compassion and tolerance and acceptance, then it feels very light and spacious and joyful. And as you recognize that, then the mind will naturally gravitate more towards metta. And Aicha B, I'm not sure how to pronounce that correctly. Aicha B says, about confessing as a layperson to a monk or a lay practitioner, are we expecting anything from them, or should they just listen? Well, the statement that's given in the suttas is that the other person just says something like, do you see your mistake? And then you say, yes, I see it. And the other person then says, you should try to be restrained in the future. So that's what's found in the suttas. So just this very simple exchange. So are you expecting anything from them? Not really. I mean, they might, if they have some advice, they might ask like, oh, can I offer some advice on how to deal with these situations better in the future? Or they might just listen and just say like, oh, I appreciate your confession, and I hope that you use this as a tool to improve your practice. I appreciate your confession, and I really do hope that things get better for you. But they might ask if they can offer some advice, if they think they might have something useful to say. And that's the last question. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude it this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.